had to stand up when he mentioned Samuel Moyn, because if you were at the first conference, I actually was on that panel with Samuel Moyn. It was the two of us. And I just completely disagreed with everything he said. I'm working on a project where I am looking at this concept of human rights in the struggle against slavery. It is very strong. So let me just say this, and I say this as a question to you mostly, Walter, but I think, Saidiya, this would obviously work for you as well. But if we go to the Oxford English Dictionary for the etymology of the word dehumanized, it is defined as, first of all, appearing around the turn of the 19th century. And it means, and I quote, to deprive of human character or attributes. Now, it's the opposite of the word humanize, which appears centuries earlier. Humanize actually appears in the 16th century. And it is defined as, quote, to humanize is to portray or endow with human characteristics, qualities or attributes to represent in human form. Now, it's also interesting that the word inhumane or inhuman appears more than a century before dehumanize, and that means brutal, unfeeling, cruel. So one way to think about dehumanization as a concept is to explore what historical actors meant when they used the term at specific moments in the past. The word was certainly used by ex-slaves. It was used by abolitionists. It has been used by free blacks in the 19th century during the slavery times and afterwards. They spoke of the denial of fundamental rights, both civil rights and human rights, through this term, dehumanization. And they identified dehumanizing actions as the active powers, the agency of slaveholders, white Americans who sanctioned slavery, and the American legal process that upheld it. So let me give you some quotes. In 1839, The Colored American, an editorial, this was a black-owned newspaper, and black people wrote in it. And these are free blacks who are writing about losing the right to vote because they could vote, and then they lost it. And they said, our disfranchisement may be said in a measure to dehumanize us. It debars us from the exercise of faculties which our maker has incorporated with our being. Now, the heavy meaning of this is the part about what our maker has incorporated in our being. This is the claim to universal humankind. Or here's another abolitionist piece, and this was in 1859, and the person was responding to Jefferson Davis, and he writes, he's opposing what Jefferson wrote about, and I quote, the state of chattelism as the normal condition of the African. That is his most perfect state. And this is what Jefferson Davis is saying, the highest and happiest development of his nature and destiny. He takes a man, makes a beast of him by slavery, then taunts him with his degradation and cuffs him for not being anything better than a beast. And then this is the key thing. He takes the Negro and dehumanizes him under the iron bondage. Here's a passage from Dred Scott. There's a response to Dred Scott and in The Liberator. It says, the case imbrutes, turns us into brutes, imbrutes and dehumanizes the race. And with a sublime touch of vandalism, it ruthlessly strips human beings of rights God-given and hands them over to be devoured by human beasts of prey. And it's interesting the way he works with that, human beasts of prey. And even in his letter from Birmingham jail, Martin Luther King talks about segregation and the just and unjust laws. And when he refers to the philosopher Martin Buber's discussion of I-it relationship and I-thou relationship, King says it ends up relegating persons to the status of things. So this is what I'm arguing. I'm arguing that when speaking of dehumanization and agency, maybe it's important to understand its conceptual power and its strategic rhetorical role, especially for African Americans and for those people who wanted to to fight against the power of others to ascribe to blacks attributes that were not human. And it's important to see this kind of agency, this dehumanizing agency and resistance, perhaps anyway, in this way. Now, Walter Johnson has written an amazing book, The River of Dark Dreams. And in this book, he talks about these pro-slavery theorists and practices of slave-owning society that reinforce and liken slaves to animals. He talks about Dr. Cartwright and Professor Harper and all these analogies to animals when he talks about these, when they talk about black people. And it's not that slaves, it's absolutely not that slaves had doubts about their humanity. Slaves never had a doubt about their humanity. And as Walter reminds us, the slave owners never really doubted that slaves were human. But I wonder if we fully understand, and this is my question to the both of you, the active power of slaves and abolitionists to use words like human rights and dehumanize and dehumanization to indict and condemn as inhumane the actions, ideas, and laws that define black people as chattel, that scientifically talked about them as descending from a different species, that promoted property rights that would permit buying and selling and bequeathing human beings to other human beings, or to be defined as 3/5 of a person in the Constitution. So none of these efforts to deprive blacks of their humanity escaped them. They weren't clueless. And so the 19th century abolitionist movement argued for a universal humanity. They talked about human rights based on the oneness of humankind. They like to say that, the oneness of humankind. And through these calls, and also through the use of the word or the concept dehumanization, and these were made not exclusively, but largely on moral and religious grounds, they laid a foundational role for the articulation of human rights in the struggle against slavery and in the universal struggle for the respect of all human beings. Thank you. Now, I want you to disagree, tell me what's going on, but what I'm saying to you is that this is a strategy that black people even use today when they argue for their rights. And so this question of agency and resistance, I think, also has to address how a concept is used in the specific historical moment in which it emerges. Not that that concept is the same over time, and it's not even used in the same context, because it continues clearly after slavery ends.
Y'all have to realize that this is sort of like being criticized by your mom in public for me. So, I mean, I think it's right at the end of what you said that I want to begin, which is with a focus on specific historical moments. Mm-hmm. So I think you're absolutely right that the notion of dehumanization has an enormous amount of political utility and force in the slave narratives of the 19th century. But I think that, and I think that this is to reiterate in some way what Lynn Festa was saying earlier. I don't want to drag her down with me. But that utility, I believe, has been exhausted in the historiography of the 20th century. So I think that the way that historians have continued to balance, to suggest that the importance of what their work does is that it proves enslaved people's humanity. The way that they have continually resuscitated the Elkins thesis in order to argue against it actually has an undercurrent of reiterating the notion that African American humanity is to be or can be questioned. So that's really the point that I'm trying to make more. Now, there's a subsidiary point about the relationship between the fact that slaveholders behaved in inhuman ways towards enslaved people And then enslaved people or self-emancipated people then termed those actions dehumanizing. And one of the ways, and that I, because I want to insist upon both the elementally human character of those sorts of abuses, and I want to insist upon the elementally human character of the kinds of interactions that characterize slavery on a daily basis, I'm reluctant to term those actions dehumanization. And so what I do in my book, which may or may not be an adequate solution to this, is I try to talk about dishumanization, about the idea of taking all of the things that a person could be and narrowing them down, forcibly narrowing them down to this set of instrumentalized capacities. And so the idea there is to try to to hold on to the sort of continual character of the violence between human beings without saying that this is, without allowing us the comfort of believing that there's some sort of transcendent notion of human beings that we can all represent and then look back on this as the past where human beings used to be inhuman to one another.
One of my favorite lines from the WPA narratives is the one who says, we are human flesh. So I understand the import of that. I guess what I was trying to talk about was the way in which every kind of bestowal or recognition of the human is at the same time an imposition and a disqualification of other forms and modes of being too. So it's really that dynamic. So when we think about, again, the performance of humanity and the requirements of that performance produces another kind of category of life that's then unfit for representation, unfit for rights. Even if we talk about that in a kind of an intra-racial context, what it means to meet the demands for a certain instantiation of the human is that those who aren't existing in kind of forms of life that are legitimate or that can advance the cause become disqualified. And I think, particularly in a new project that I'm working in the aftermath of slavery, where you then have people who are to some degree, who can exercise certain kinds of formal rights, then that kind of new order of kind of racial dispossession is precisely about kind of policing these forms of being and these forms of life, these modes of sociality that aren't faithful to certain kinds of scripts of, of labor, of intimacy, of sociality, and then that becomes the target of certain forms of kind of state activity, as well as, a target for reformers like Du Bois, right? So I think is there an ensemble of kind of behaviors or modes of sociality or existence that we can describe as the human, or is that notion of the human so overwritten by the language of the man that we must all kind of translate our claims into that narrative, that frame? And I guess I want to open up the question, is there something that is actually made possible for those who exist in a different kind of relationship with objects and animals, right? So does the slave then have a kind of knowledge that maybe we're trying to actually get to in the 21st century precisely because of those disqualified forms of recognition, because of the forms of association with inanimate things or with animal life? Might that open up certain forms, certain kinds of political possibility?
Well, we're going to open it up to you, so please come to the mic and ask our panelists questions.
Can I make just a tiny linguistic point, since you mentioned the dictionaries, and since there was a difference here between inhumanity and dehumanizing, the concept of dignity, which is considered to be at the basis of human rights, is in the Hebrew Bible in the image of God. That concept, B'Tselem Elohim, in the image of God, is synonymous to dignity. In the 2nd century, it's not in the Bible, in the 2nd century, Rabbi Akiva and then Maimonides onwards, and today in the Hebrew vernacular, in the human image is the word for being humane. Mm-hmm. And if you lose your human image, you are inhuman. Brutal actions mm-hmm. are pinpointed, even down in journalism, as having lost their human image. So I'm wondering about the concept of image here that's playing a big role in talking. There's nothing in Hebrew about dehumanizing. Thank you.
Can I just say real quickly, though, because I'm attentive to the religious and moral language, that is one of the big arguments, that man is made in the image of God. And that's why man is universal, or humankind, as they like to say. Yes?
I thought these two papers worked very well together, but it raised a question for me. When I think about the first paper, slavery seems to have a personal character to master and slave, a certain, I think as Walter pointed out, a certain human character to that relationship. Whereas at least if I could extend Walter's economic analysis, today might typically talk about people that own capital, people that have intellectual capital, people who have social capital, people who are merely human capital, some of whom are human raw material, a world that's raw material. It seems in some ways that economic way of thinking about things is less human, is more dehumanizing in a whole variety of ways than the relationship within slavery, which sees a real other across from you and not just some abstract material. So I wonder if you could both comment on that.
I guess that part of what I am always interested in trying to do is to rethink our analytical categories from the standpoint of slavery. So to recognize that most of our analytical categories emerge from histories that are trying to define the categories of human being as different from the way that enslaved people lived. And so capital is one of those, right? So the notion of human capital, which sounds alienated when we say it, is in fact elementally a part of what it is to be of the condition of enslaved humanity, right? The notion that one is always collateral, always collateralized. The notion that if one's owner doesn't meet payments, your family can be liquidated. And so in that sense, I don't necessarily want to think about the world of slavery being more direct and human and the world of capitalism being more abstract and mystified. I want to try to think about the world of capital that you talk about as actually being predicated on a sort of set of direct dominations that are analogous to those of enslavement, but as being subject to a different set of mystifications, right? And that's what Du Bois seems to me to be saying when he employs the notion of the veil in this way, is that the dominations of production are hidden in the freedoms of consumption. And that's so I think that probably I would like to take those that foundational separation that you were suggesting and kind of muddy it a bit.
And I guess I would say what Walter said, but differently in terms of thinking about, the sentience of the commodity, or how are these relationships of property and dispossession lived, and how do they actually shape and inform intimate experience. And I think that part of the dehumanization, objectification argument is that there are certain forms of affective response that negate that condition. And what happens if those responses are a kind of elaboration and intensification of one's object status as opposed to its redress? So it's about that kind of messy entanglement.
I mean, so just to give a more concrete example, one of the things that, if you're going to talk about the commodification of human beings, the place that happens is the slave market. Well, as it turns out, what happens in a slave market is that slave buyers go and they ask enslaved people questions. And those enslaved people answer those questions with some kind of performance, and sometimes they lie. And so what's happening there is that there's just an impossibly dense exchange between commodification and humanity. And I mean, I think the other thing that is important to recognize in what Saidiya was saying is that we use the word agency as if in one of the possible meanings of agency, as if agency is always resistant to slavery. Agency also means taking the actions that are taken through someone on behalf of another person. And so what if we tried to hold those two ideas together as the condition of enslaved humanity, rather than saying one of these things is agency, sub one, resistance, and that's good and human, and the other thing we don't really want to talk about.
I wanted to ask each of you about a word you used. In Walter Johnson's case, I kept waiting to see what term you would use if you're not using dehuman or inhuman, and you came up with a word of abject or abjection.
Yeah, I stole that from Saidiya.
Pardon me?
I stole it from her.
Well, but in any case, what I wanted to find out in your case, in that, what is the work that abjection, the abject, does for you that the others do not? And in your case, Saidiya, I was struck by the work that you had pornography do. And in this sense, first of all, it is a historical category, right, which does not exist in the 18th century, but keeps shifting over time, and its late 20th century, 21st century manifestations are also different. And at the same time, I want to relate that to one of the problematics of human rights discourse that you raised, which is the ways in which certain spectacles are now deployed in order to elicit some sort of action on the part of the beholder, the spectator, and the way in which the stakes keep being upped on the violent, or however you want to call it, nature of that spectacle in order to elicit response. And at the same time, I mean, when things, for example, I was thinking here of the piece that Butler did on Abu Ghraib. I don't know if you know that piece, but indeed where there's a kind of pornography of representation, but how else to elicit horror on the part of the spectator?
It's a great question, and I think, it is something that I could probably stand to think more about. But what I'm using that word to do is to try to hold in tension the notion of human being and dishumanization without using the word dehumanization. And so now I think there's another thing that it might bear worth saying is that and a couple of the quotations that Evelyn read made me think that I need to think about this a little bit more. But as I read 19th century pro-slavery racial thought, which I have read a lot of, I don't see people making the argument that Africans or enslaved people are not human. I see them making arguments that make them analogous to animals, but not animals. And so it's that I want to call dishumanization. And I think that that we need to think very carefully about the differences between racist hierarchies that occur within the category of the human, the races of mankind, which seems to me to be very prevalent in 19th century pro-slavery thought, scientific and otherwise, and the notion that what's happening is that enslaved people are being shut out from the category of humanity. And so that's a tension that I'm trying to hold on to throughout, because I do think that what I'm saying is that the argument against dehumanization, which says, oh, no, 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 I've written a 700-page book and I've discovered that slaves are human beings, right, actually reiterates the kind of probationary character of that humanity without denying it, right? And that's, I think, what I'm trying to do with abjection. But it is, I understand that it has enough as a word for people in fields other than mine. It has enough resonance that it might bear thinking about. Yeah, right, exactly. Yeah.
Why don't you go to the microphone? Will.
I guess I would say two things. So I'm thinking of pornography in the literal term as like the writing of whores, right? And so what does it mean to then, that this is the place where certain kinds of subjects appear? So thinking about, that the biographical accounts that I so long for are now before me in a domain that I don't want to encounter, but because I'm looking for a life presented in certain ways. So that's where the pornography comes in the 18th century context. And you're right as well to think about this kind of spectacular representations of pain to kind of elicit feelings and to underscore our common humanity and the kind of the libidinal investment in those kinds of spectacularizations of pain. So it was the conversion of thinking about, who's fit or unfit for history, and then when they appear, how is it that they appear? So distinct and overlapping.
Yes, I'm very moved and very enriched by this conversation, and I keep coming up with the image of what is wrong with child soldiers today. I've been doing a lot of work in that subject in Africa, and we take a child and we commodify that child and we sell that child to a warlord and then make that child into a soldier. Very good soldier. Kills and kills and kills and kills for years, fearlessly. And that child has lost something precious at the end of that process. And we're all in the same boat. We are all in the same boat. There's an essential oneness somehow that defines us, slave or free or slave holder. And I think that this question of the language we use is a striving to get to that oneness that is us, that must be validated and defended. So that's what I take away from this, and I thank you for it.
And then you.
I'm going to pick up on Eleanor's.
Sorry. I know
That's
you.
what I meant, Evelyn. Evelyn's comment, but from the point of view of my other specialty, which is language. And together with Evelyn, I did feel that there was something a little odd about criticizing, of all the people that one can criticize when it comes to slavery, the people who say, isn't it terrible that slaves have been dehumanized, would seem to be pretty low on the list. So how do you get to the point where all of these advocates of the humanity and the suffering of slavery become the target of criticism? And it seems to me that you're taking language way too literally, that probably the vast majority of English words, if you were to look at their etymology, look at their literal meaning, you would immediately see that that has nothing to do with the way people commonly use the word. I mean, we use the word atom, which literally means can't be split, even though we split the atom, but that's not a problem. It's just because words are used, are approximations to label something that get kind of grandfathered in. If you look at their etymology too literally, you're going to find any word in the English language is going to be inappropriate. So, December, it's not the 10th month anymore, but we can still call it December. So it seems to me pretty clear that when most people, in fact, when everyone uses the word dehumanize, if I say that John dehumanizes Bill, when I say that, I don't mean that Bill is subhuman. I mean that John is treating Bill subhuman in a particular sense of human, not that John thinks that Bill can't understand language. Not that John thinks that humans are good and don't do terrible things, but there's just one aspect of human that I'm attributing to John as denying to Bill, namely the difference between the way we characteristically treat other members of Homo sapiens and the way we characteristically treat animals such as vermin and beasts of burden and so on. So if you interpret language charitably, that is, the way that people always use language, namely there is just one aspect of the literal meaning of the word that actually governs usage, then I think that would explain why the people who use the language of dehumanization are in fact not bad people, they're good people, and it seems a little odd to criticize them. I'm suggesting that criticism comes from a rather eccentric view of how language is used.
Yeah, that's interesting and helpful. One thing that I was very careful to say is I was very careful to say that these are not bad people. I was very careful to say that they are people who are operating within a certain epistemology of human freedom and humanity, and that is a liberal notion. And so I actually think that the point about talking about dehumanization is there is a sort of a literalism to my first reading of it. But what I'm really talking about is a connotation. And that connotation is that what has been deprived, what someone has been deprived of that renders them dehumanized is the capacity of independent will and volition. Now that's a particular notion of what a human being is. That's a particularly liberal notion of what a human being is. And so the quarrel that I'm having then is with that notion of human being as a universal solution to all wrongs. And so what I'm trying to suggest is that a history like the history of slavery might require a different form of redress, right? That there might be a different set of answers. And so I take the point, about the way that people use language, but I actually think that I'm in sympathy with with what you said. Now it is very difficult. This is a little bit of a disciplinary problem. As a historian, what I have to do is to use people's statements to convey some kind of ethnographic sense of connotation. And so there's always a tension there between a very, very hard-headed sort of literary critical reading of a statement and the subtending world of, quickly expressed ideas in speech, evanescent ideas, evanescent speeches that I'm trying to convey. But I am really ultimately trying to talk about a set of connotations around a liberal notion of humanity through that notion.
So I just wanted to follow up on one of Professor Johnson's really interesting points that I think connects this discussion back to the panel before, which is that if we thought about slavery and its relationship to economic production really as paradigmatic in questions of rights, that might not only move gender back closer to the center of rights discourse, but also has huge implications for non-human animals. So all the practices that Professor Johnson quickly rattled off with regards to kind of the everyday life of slavery, rape, forced impregnation, separation of the mother from her babies, and even the instrumentalization of breast milk are actually, whether you think they're wrong in the case of animals or not, they're undeniably part of the structure of animal slavery, animal production, whatever you want to call it, that is exactly, basically, a mirror of the structure of human slavery. And so I think that treating not just genocide, but slavery as really paradigmatic for any kind of moral discourse about rights troubles our moral discourse every bit as much as the scientific discourse that Professor Radick was talking about earlier was already troubled on the question of the human and the non-human animal. And then on a different point, just very quickly, and not to try to continue a dialogue that I think Professor Pinker might have just rendered dead on this question of sort of vocabulary and things like that, I'm always surprised when these questions of dehumanization or now dishumanization, and then for a long time I fell down the rabbit hole of all the debates about dignity as well. Whenever I reread Letter from Birmingham Jail, which I do whenever possible and recommend that anybody in the world do as often as possible, I'm surprised that the very simple and unbelievably beautiful terms of somebodyness and nobodyness that MLK uses in that document haven't been treated as serious political, philosophical, as a serious vocabulary. It seems to me that if you could somehow send Martin Luther King Jr. back in time and have him help write the preamble of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and instead of getting us into this thing on inherent dignity that's now produced slews of debates and scholarship and all this stuff and had people batting their heads against each other, but if you just talked about somebodyness as something that you both feel in yourself and demand recognition from everybody else, there's something just, I guess, personally to me that's always seemed much more elegant about that than any of these other terminologies.
So I think the thing with which you began about animals is a really fascinating idea. And part of my own effort to try to rethink a lot of these categories from the standpoint of slavery is a critique of Marx, and it's a critique of, in a very, very simple way, it's a critique of capital, which begins with the consideration of a bolt of linen rather than a bolt of cotton, which seems like an evasion of the history of slavery. And I think that you could say the same thing about, and without wanting to throw the baby out with the bathwater, about the way in which labor is treated in capital, right? That is a world in which much of the energy that is used to convert things into commodities is animal energy. So I think that's a really, really interesting point.
Can I ask Walter a follow-up question, and particularly about the Du Bois and the Black Reconstruction? So, you were talking about the challenge of that for a human rights frame, but I was thinking very much of Marx and thinking, well, so then does Du Bois have a different answer to the question of human rights than where the Marx would take us, and particularly thinking of on the Jewish questions? Because basically part of the magisterial work of Black Reconstruction is getting us to imagine the slave as a particular instantiation of the laborer, which is productive in some ways, but I think limiting in others. So
yeah, there's a real problem for me if I want to take that text and say this is what I think, because a lot of the text is focused around the notion of the human, right? And he simply says, well, what this is a history of, if you just use the category of the human, then the whole thing falls apart. So I think I want to read parts of it and not other parts. And I think that the chapter on the black worker, I think, is a narrowing of the possible set of notions of what enslaved humanity is, subjective notions. I think that the quotation that I read here is a broadening, and it's that broadening that I'm interested in. I'm also, there's a fantastic quotation that I didn't read about the notion of the philosophy of life and action of enslaved people. And that seems to me to again draw us back to the notion of the condition of slaved humanity. He says that there's a particular philosophy of action that has to do with slavery. Well, the philosophy of action is this extremely technical version of analytic philosophy that I'm sure many of you understand better than I do, but it's about how are actions intentioned or not. Does one intend to do something, or does one discover one's own intentions in the action itself? And to say that that is embedded in enslavement seems to me to be a powerful way of evoking a condition that is at once very, very determined and insistently transcendent. Right? So it's a different version of what is an agent than we get from our sort of liberal collapse of the notion of agency.
Okay, we'll get our last question, Robert.
Well, this exchange actually helped me to understand somewhat this issue, because I have a question about your title and your role as a historian. I mean, I take the point that the concept of dehumanization links the ideal of humanity, given the way that concept was used at the time and the way it's used now, with an ideal of humanity that is linked, let us say, essentially to liberal constitutional democracy and its ideals, and therefore necessarily to the material practices of liberal democracy, that is, market and eventually global capitalism. And there's no way to apply the term without implying that the end of slavery, and so the liberation of free will and consenting agenthood, is effectively liberation, that that's all we need, and that's dangerous. But it is certainly true that a component of a free or liberated life would be the exercise of volition in the absence of property constraints on one's action. So wouldn't it be better to say not what's wrong with dehumanization, but what's wrong with something like its totalization? There's something very right with the idea of arguing, at least minimally, we have to be liberated to a state in which we can exercise our own will and make our own choices. And the second, so historically, and this really goes to some of the things you were saying as well. I mean, I get the point about being provocative in your title, but what's wrong with dehumanization seems to me to overstate your case. I mean, there's something wrong with its exclusivity and with the satisfaction we might take in the liberation of slaves to non-chattel status, such that the labor situation described by Du Bois is acceptable because it's all voluntary contract labor, and we should forget about it after that. But the second point is how you understand the transition from this partial liberal sense of agency, basically as a consumer, let's say, to make the point most tendentiously, and its eventual overcoming. This is actually relevant to the question you just asked. Its eventual overcoming in a status that doesn't define one merely as a consumer or producer or a laborer or an owner. Do you think of that as, in a way, a kind of historical dynamic, that it is your professional expertise to explain to us in the same way that it might be explicable that the language of humanism by even slave owners eventually became such a kind of lived out contradiction that it was not historically possible to sustain the institution? Or are you speaking as you're perfectly free to do, of course, a moral thinker who simply regards the current conditions of labor under capitalism as immoral, and that you're encouraging us to think that there's a higher form of liberation than the liberation from slavery assumed? And if so, on what basis, if you give us some idea, on what basis do you make this moral appeal to us?
So, in relationship to the first question, again, I think that what I was trying to say is that a notion of human emancipation predicated on liberal constitutionalism is the best thing that's happened in the history of the world. So, now what I am also saying is that it is not the only imaginable version of human freedom, and nor do I think it is a finally sufficient version of human freedom. So I don't want to be seen as, so I really try to adhere to that sort of dialectical tension. And that, I guess, is part of my answer to the second question. So my answer to the second question would be, it seems to me, and this is where Evelyn and I have our only argument ever about, but it seems to me that the way, at least the ballast of that liberal constitutionalist notion of human rights in most contemporary discussions, the ballast for that is the wrongs of the 20th century and Europe in particular and the Holocaust in particular. And so what I want to say is not instead of that, but in addition to that, what if we were to think about the wrongs of slavery as a definitive version of wrong in modernity, and to try and theorize a version of human rights responsive to that? And so that then leads, so that leads me then to these, what at the end were 5 sort of briefly outlined components of what a version of justice based on the history of slavery would look like, that seemed to me to be in excess of what we conventionally call human rights talk. On what moral authority do I do that? I suppose that's just me popping off.
Well, thank you.